Om Namah Shri Arvindaya. So let me begin this session with a heartfelt thanks to Samdananji and all the Rishi University members who have given me this opportunity to present this topic in front of all of you today. So I have been to the Delhi Ashram in the past many times, and I consider it a grace from the Mother that I have been speaking in this ICPR series where such distinguished personalities such as Ramesh ji and Makaran ji have spoken. And although I don't consider myself worthy to be speaking on the same series, but I take it as a grace from the Mother and I'll try to make the best use of it. To give you all a brief introduction about myself, so I was born and brought up in Sirsa, which is 250 kilometers from here. And I still remember my first contact with Sri Aurobindo. So I was in my class 4th or 5th, I guess, and we had a lecture on one of our history modules. And there was a lecture on the Alipur bomb trial case. So Sri Aurobindo's picture was on the left side of the page, and it is the same picture that we have in the meditation hall today. And on the right-hand side, we have the description of the Alipur bomb trial. So when I looked at the picture of Sri Aurobindo, I felt such a calm and peace effusing from it. And Sri Aurobindo's Rishi-like personality left a deep impression just from that first picture. And I also was struck by the contrast between that picture and what was mentioned on the right-hand side about the Alipur bomb trial case, that there were some bomb thrown on British civilians and so on. So I was struck by the contrast. So how could a Rishi-like personality that Sri Aurobindo was, how he could have guided this revolutionary activity? And of course, I got the answers when I got to study Sri Aurobindo later during my college days. So when I was studying in IIT, so I got a chance to read Sri Aurobindo's Secret of the Veda. I was always looking to read something about the Veda. So they were the key Indian scriptures that intrigued me the most. And it was only Sri Aurobindo who was able to answer my questions. So this is just a brief introduction about me. So the topic for today that we are going to discuss is Sri Aurobindo as the prophet of Indian nationalism. And this is a very, very broad topic. Sri Aurobindo has left his comments on almost all the nations of the world. So this is an experiment that I conducted I took all the nations of the world. I looked at Sri Aurobindo and the Mother's comments on each and every one of them. And I was able to find at least one comment from Mother and Sri Aurobindo on almost all the nations. And that comment was not made in passing. They had a very key psychological insight about what each nation represented in the course of humanity. So if you are planning to study anything about any of the countries around the globe, I would suggest that you go through the Sri Aurobindo and the Mother's works and find out what they have said about that nation. And that will give you a key insight about the psychological temperament of the people of that nation. So for this topic today, I'll not go into much details. I would try to tell you two stories. One is the story of the nation. So how the nations have evolved from smaller human aggregates to the larger human aggregates. And I'll take help from Sri Aurobindo's The Human Cycle. And I'll tell you the story of Sri Aurobindo himself, how he contributed to the Indian nationalist struggle, and how he tried to, through his actions, guide India on the path of the Renaissance. So let's begin with the first story of the nation. So generally when we study the history of a nation, we look at only two sides. One is its political aspect, so how the political grouping was formed, and then we look at the society or the social aspect. But Sri Aurobindo introduces the third aspect to the picture, and that is the psychological aspect. Sri Aurobindo says that a nation is the psychological unit first, and it is only secondarily a political or a social unit. And that psychological basis that Sri Aurobindo provides, I find it unique among the world's philosophers and world's social thinkers. So nobody has talked about with such emphasis on the psychological aspect of a nation like Sri Aurobindo. If you look at the definition that Sri Aurobindo provides of a nation, so Sri Aurobindo describes a nation as a spiritual being which evolves a mental, vital, and physical personality for the evolutionary purpose. So essentially, like we as individuals have a mental, vital, and physical personality, similarly, a nation also evolves a mental, vital, and physical personality for the evolutionary purpose. And there is a very interesting conversation of Sri Aurobindo from 24th of Feb 1939, where he answers many questions related to what kind of a being is behind each of these collective personalities that we define as nations. So I'll just read it to you. So the disciple asks Sri Aurobindo, do the nations have a soul? And Sri Aurobindo answers, yes, you can speak of it as a collective or national being or entity, but it is not in evolution, it is not subject to the law of karma. So essentially what Sri Aurobindo is saying that each national being is a typal being, like the gods that we have. When Mother was asked about what kind of a being is Mother India, she mentioned that she is of the same level of being as Shiva. So essentially she is a goddess, right? So she is not in evolution, she is not subject to the law of karma, but she is a spiritual being that has descended for a particular purpose. Then the disciple asks, can it be said that the law governing it is supra-rational? And Sri Aurobindo answers, yes, each collective being is a projection of the cosmic spirit for a particular purpose. You can speak of it as a particular Shakti. So essentially each collective being that has descended onto the earth, it is for a particular purpose of the cosmic will. Then disciple asks, how does the collective being or Shakti work? Sri Aurobindo says, it identifies itself with a particular form, here of a group of individuals. There is a mutual action, it acts on the individual and the individual acts on it by manifesting it. So essentially Mother India acts on us through her own power, right? So she is trying to reincarnate the spiritual force in the world, and she is acting on the individuals like us. And we also help her by manifesting her force in the world. So there is always a mutual action between these two aspects. Then the disciple asks, suppose this collective entity is dissolved from life. So we have in the past many examples where these collective entities have perished due to one reason or the other. We read about it in the Bible that there are so many nations that have perished on the face of the earth. So what happens to the collective being behind them? Sri Aurobindo says, when the physical form of the collectivity is dissolved here, the collective being withdraws into the origin. So essentially, it withdraws into the original cosmic spirit. And the disciple says, can a collective being, after such a dissolution, take another group for manifesting itself? Essentially, if there is a reincarnation of these kind of spiritual beings. Sri Aurobindo says, we have as yet no proof of it. So Sri Aurobindo denies that there is such kind of reincarnation. So essentially, this gives you an idea of what kind of collective being, what kind of spiritual entity is behind each nation. Now, but if you look at the evolution of a nation, we see on the outer personality that there is a smaller aggregate that evolves into a larger aggregate. So what is the smallest human aggregate we can think of? It is the family unit, right? So the family unit evolves into the tribe, then to the city-state, then to the regional state, then to the empire or the nation, and finally there is the world unity. So the question naturally arises, why is there a movement towards this larger unity? Why do smaller aggregates tend to move towards larger aggregates? And Sri Aurobindo discusses this problem in a series of essays in the human cycle, and he particularly mentions that humanity's most creative periods were those in which it lived in independent centers. So essentially, Sri Aurobindo takes the example of the Greek city-state. So the Greek city-state produced such a culture that it has impressed its culture upon the current European civilization. So current European civilization has grown in the same mold as the Greek city-state, what the culture that Greek city-state produced. Similarly, Sri Aurobindo takes the example of Jewish tribes, the medieval Italy, which also influenced the current European civilization. He takes the example of Vedic civilization, which was essentially small tribes which created such a culture that it has impressed their culture on all of India. And Sri Aurobindo gives a very key reason for this. He says that collective life, when it diffuses itself into too vast space, seems to lose intensity and productiveness. So essentially, if you want to maintain an intense creative output, you have to have an intense life, intense united life. And if you diffuse the life in too vast a space, then it will lose its intensity. But there was a defect in all of these small aggregates like city-states. And Sri Aurobindo says that was their defenselessness against the outer barbarism. So essentially, each of these city-states had produced a remarkable culture. But what happened was they were surrounded by this surrounding barbarism, which was always on the attack, right? So they wanted to capture this culture and the fruits of this culture. So essentially, it was imperative for these city-states to grow and to acquire larger population for their own defense. And that is why they grew into these larger aggregates. But this movement to larger aggregates, as we see, is not always very easy, right? So there is always a conflict of interest. To give you an example, I would say that if a soldier dies for his country, right, that is there is a conflict of interest involved here, because the family would not want the soldier to die, but the nation wants the soldier to die for its sake. So there is a conflict of interest always when we move from smaller aggregates to larger aggregates. And Sri Aurobindo says that if the smaller aggregates were dissolved every time the larger aggregate was formed, then this conflict would not have been there. But this conflict is there because nature wants a diverse unity. Nature doesn't want a uniform unity. Nature doesn't want only an Indian to exist. Nature wants the family unit to exist, the regional unit to exist, and then India to exist. So basically, this is the reason that we see a lot of tendencies today that the family unit should be dissolved or the regional unit should be dissolved. But Sri Aurobindo says that is not the way of the nature. Nature wants a diverse unity. Sri Aurobindo gives the example of India and says that India has the most disparate elements in it. So we have the family, we have the caste, we have the regional state, we have the linguistic unit, we have the religious community. So there are so many subnations or subgroupings in India. But India was able to create a unique political structure that represented all these classes and was able to allow the diversity to thrive without breaking its unity. And that was the Indian political genius. But that genius was not manifest in the actual political unity. So essentially, India was not able to create a political unity. India was able to create a civilizational and spiritual unity. And for creating the political units, nature had to bring in force from outside, like the British Empire, to create that unity for us. So we will discuss why that is the case. Now, coming to Sri Aurobindo's time, we see that there were two major units that were thriving at the time of Sri Aurobindo. They were the empire and the nation. And Sri Aurobindo brings a very key insight that the empire unit is artificial while nation unit is real. So nation unit is the real unity while empire is the artificial unity. And he gives a very compelling reason why that is the case. So he writes, when an empire like Austria, which is a non-national empire, is broken to pieces, it perishes for good. So there is no innate tendency to recover the outward unity because there is no real inner oneness. But if a national unity is broken up, it will always preserve a tendency to recover. So essentially, if you break a nation, it will always try to recover its oneness. While if you break an empire, it will just break, right? It will not try to recover. Sri Aurobindo gives many examples like the Greek Empire. So Greek Empire broke up, but the Greek nation survived. So Greek nation was able to recover its unity from the Ottoman. And Sri Aurobindo gives the example of Israel and other nations. And particularly in India, Sri Aurobindo says, there we had the political ideal of Ashmed and Rajasuya Yagya. So Ashmed and Rajasuya Yagya, what it entailed was, we wanted to create an imperial unity of all the Indian peoples. But it was not successful because of certain challenges, and we will discuss those challenges. So coming to how a nation unit is formed, right? Sri Aurobindo describes how a nation unit is formed, and we will see why India was not able to create that political unity. So Sri Aurobindo describes 3 stages in which a nation unit is formed. He says, first, there is some kind of loose yet sufficiently compelling social order that creates a common type of civilization. So essentially in India, we see that there are these fourfold orders, right? We have the Brahmin, Kshatriya, Shudra, Vaishya. So this kind of social construct that is created, and we have 4 Purusharthas like Dharam, Arth, Kam, and Moksha. So a common type of civilization is created that is there throughout the length and breadth of the country. Similarly, Sri Aurobindo gives the example of Japan, European countries, and China, which each of them have their own specific social construct, and that is what unites the people at first. In the second step, after this social order is there, Sri Aurobindo says there comes a period of stringent organization directed towards creating unity, creating political unity. And that is where India failed. And India failed because of few reasons that Sri Aurobindo lists out. Sri Aurobindo says, because of the vastness of space of India and the insufficiency of communications at that time, India was not able to create a effective centralized control. And also, people were not drawn as close as needed. So essentially, because to effectively centrally control a nation, you have to have contact between all the centers, right, of the republic. And that was not there in India. Second reason that Sri Aurobindo gives is the absence of will to uniformity in India. So essentially, India didn't want to uniformize all the sub-elements. So India had a tolerant way to deal with the diversity. While in Europe, we see that the uniforming tendency was very strong. So they were able to quickly create those nations, but India was not able to create that political unity for a long time. In India, we see that there is no class warfare in any of our history. This is because that tolerant policy that India adopted, but there was also no political unity as such. So these are the two steps, and the third step is once that unity is secured and it becomes a mental and vital habit of the people. So essentially, people recognize that unity in their blood. Then you give them a freedom to pursue their own interests. So for the organism to thrive, you have to have some free internal development. So you don't want the centralized control to be always there. You want people to thrive and have their free internal development. So as soon as the national unity is secured, you give free internal development to the people. And this is something that we see that India is doing today. So India is, after a period of centralized control, so India is allowing the people to freely develop themselves according to their own temperament. Now, we have looked at why India was not able to create that political unity. But the question comes, why England was chosen to create that political unity for us? So why not any other power? So in India, we see that multiple powers had arrived. So the French, the English, the Portuguese, right? So why was the England chosen for this task of colonizing India? So Sri Aurobindo gives that answer in one of his articles in Karma Yogi. He says that spirit and ideals of India had come to be confined in a mold which, however beautiful, was too narrow to bear the mighty burden of our future. So essentially, India had a beautiful culture, but that culture had become stagnated due to various reasons, and it didn't allow for the new forces to manifest for the new role that India had to play in the world. And due to that, it had to be broken. And which force is the best to broke that vase? It is a force which is exactly opposite of India. So Sri Aurobindo says that England was the best instrument for this because her temperament was exactly opposite of India. So England had a stubborn individuality and a very commercial and materialistic outlook on the world. And India, as we see, India had a more communal mindset in which each community represented a particular part to the divine, and we didn't have that kind of individualization that England had. And our outlook was not commercial or materialistic. So England was best fitted to break the mold that India found itself in. And also England was not brutal in its treatment of its subject people, like the Portuguese and others. So if there was a choice, so England was the best choice at that moment of time. So this is about how why India was not able to create a political unit, but England was chosen for that particular task. But the question arises, after a nation is formed, right? So what is the next step for humanity? So the next step is to create a world union. So now we see that the nation has been perfected almost everywhere, but the world union is still in its beginning stages. And Sri Aurobindo describes it in an aphorism of his. He says, family, nationality, and humanity are Vishnu's 3 steps from an isolated to a collective unity. The first, that is family, has been fulfilled. We yet strive for the perfection of the second, that is nationality. And towards the third, that is human unity, we are still reaching out our hands, and the pioneer work is already attempted. So essentially, Sri Aurobindo is saying that family has already been accomplished, nationality we are still perfecting, and for human union, we are still doing some work. Some work is still required to reach that stage. Sri Aurobindo also discusses what kind of world union we would have if certain tendencies got fulfilled. So he says that first option is to have a world state in which we will have a centralized control and uniform culture throughout the world. Sri Aurobindo describes the dangers of this approach and says that would suck out the individual liberty of all the peoples. And he mentions so many dangers of it, and he doesn't prefer that option. He prefers the second option, which is a federation of free nationalities in which all nations would have an equal status and equal say in the matters of the world. And we see that that second option is what UNO that we see, right? United Nations is progressing towards. So this is about the formation of nation from a political side. But there is also a social side to the nation. So the society also progresses in cycles. And Sri Aurobindo describes this quite in his seminal work, The Human Cycle. He has elaborated on an interesting theory of social progression, which is very which is very similar to the Indian Chaturyuga theory. So India's theory is that society progresses to Satyug, to Treta, to Dwapar, to Kalyug. And similarly, there is a progression that Sri Aurobindo describes from the symbolic age to typal age to conventional age and to the individualistic age. So I'll just briefly describe this theory as well. So the first step of this cycle is the symbolic age. In India, this corresponds to the Vedic age. In the symbolic age, what happens is you try to recreate the divine reality through earthly symbols. For example, in the Vedic cycle, we see that the human marriage was supposed to be a reproduction of the marriage that happened between Soma and Surya. So Soma represents bliss in Veda, and Surya represents the knowledge. So this connect between bliss and knowledge is trying to be recreated in earth through the human marriage. Similarly, we have the fourfold order of society, which is based upon the body of the Virat Purusha. So the Kshatriyas are supposed to be the arms of the Virat Purusha, the Brahmins are supposed to be the head of the Virat Purusha. So you are trying to recreate that divine reality in earthly terms. So this symbolic age is more spiritual and religious. After this, there comes the typal age. So the spiritual component goes behind a veil, and the psychological and ethical components come to the front. So in this typal age, we have great social ideals. So who is the ideal Brahmin, who is the ideal Kshatriya, or who is the ideal husband, what is the ideal union, right? So all those high social ideals are created in this typal age. In the third age, we have the conventions. So what happens is, all these high ideals are then fixed into a convention, into a routine. So essentially, the ethical principle goes behind a veil, and what comes to the front is the conventional tendency. So you erect a system of rigid grades and hierarchies. Your Varna system devolves into a caste system. Your marriage becomes something that is just sanctioned by the tradition. So you don't have the knowledge about the deeper values why this union is created. So this is the conventional age. And after that, once the difference between the truth and the convention becomes too large, so the individual finds itself stifled by that gap. And there is a revolt, there is a period of revolt, which Sri Aurobindo calls as the individualistic age. So essentially, this happened in Europe in the form of Protestant Reformation. In India, there has been an efforts for reform movements since the Buddhistic period. We see a lot of reform movements that have gone, but Sri Aurobindo mentions that they were always very tolerant, they were not destructive. But after the British came, the reform movements have become more and more destructive. So they are destroying the forms, past forms. But in the past, the reform movements were not as destructive. And after the individualistic age, when we have destroyed the past forms, right? So there comes the subjective age. So since we have to re-seek the inner meaning of reality, life and reality, so there is a subjective search for that truth. So what is the meaning of life? What is the meaning of reality? We try to find it again, and that is when the subjective age is created. So any society moves from this symbolic to typal to the age of conventions to the individualistic age, and then to the subjective age. And we see that in India, we have been struggling with this individualistic age as of now, and we are trying to enter the subjective age. Now, what kind of future does Sri Aurobindo see for the social aspect, right? From a national aspect, we know that the world is moving towards a world unity. But from a social side, what is it moving towards? Sri Aurobindo says that a subjective age may lead to a spiritual age, and spiritual age is what Sri Aurobindo sees as the culmination. But Sri Aurobindo warns us that a subjective age may stop very far short of spirituality, because subjective age is the first condition, not the thing in itself. And Sri Aurobindo also discusses how that progression from subjective to spiritual age may happen. He says that in the 19th century, we had a lot of focus on materialism. So essentially, we had the Industrial Revolution there, and the thought was that everything is matter. So everything arose from matter, so everything is a product of matter. But in the earlier 20th century, we see that a vitalistic tendency arose in the nations. So there was a hunger for resources to satisfy life instincts. So everything was thought of as coming from the life instinct. So everything was there to satisfy your life instinct. So this kind of thinking that was there in the 20th century, it led to the two destructive world wars that we saw. Then came the age of mental subjectivism. So essentially, where we think of the mind as the source of everything. And there is an increasing tendency to rationalize our own life. We see that there is so much focus on increasing efficiency of all our life processes. We see that there is a hunt of hidden mind powers. So in the field of artificial intelligence, we are trying to map the human subconscious and trying to see how the hidden powers of humanity can be used. So this is the age of mental subjectivism. Sri Aurobindo says that a true spiritual age can only occur if in this age of mental subjectivism, we turn away from the mind and towards the spirit. So essentially what we do is we think of mind as a secondary power and spirit as the original power, and only then there would be a starting of a spiritual age. Then only we can proceed towards a spiritual age. So this is how Sri Aurobindo sees the progress of this subjective age. So we have discussed about the political and social side, right? So how a nation is evolved and what kind of social progress we see. But now I would like to come to the story of Sri Aurobindo, which is the second section of the talk. So Sri Aurobindo came at a very significant time when both from political aspect and from the social aspect, there were some tendencies which could have been very destructive. For example, on the political side, we see that the national units were emerging, and there were two specific threats. So first was the threat from the imperialist powers who were hampering the emergence of many nations. For example, the Britain was not allowing India to emerge, right, to its own spiritual heritage, to its own temperament. And similarly, the Asian nations were subject as a whole. So they needed some guidance on how to recover themselves, how to achieve their freedom. So Sri Aurobindo did that work in India as an example to the world. Then there was this national egoism that were rising all around the world. So nations in their own national search, they tried to think of the national ego as the eternal rather than the national soul. And we see that this kind of tendency led to World War I and World War II. So someone had to show that national soul is separate from the national ego and how to find that national soul. On the social side, most of humanity was moving towards an individualistic and subjective age. So someone had to show the way how we can move towards a spiritual age. And we saw what kind of destruction could happen if some kind of false subjectivism arose. For example, in Germany, we saw that the vital ego of the state was taken as the supreme under Nazi Germany, and what kind of destruction followed after that. So someone had to show how to move from this conventional age and individualistic age to the spiritual age. So Sri Aurobindo accomplished all of these work in his life, and we will particularly focus on his actions in the Indian freedom movement, but this is just to give you a broad picture of what Sri Aurobindo accomplished on the political and social side. So I'll give you a brief overview of Sri Aurobindo's life journey. I believe all of you would be aware of Sri Aurobindo's life journey. I'll focus on his political life more. So Sri Aurobindo, we know that he was born in India, but he was educated in England and purposefully kept away from Indian culture. And the outer reason for it was that his father wanted him to be a British gentleman. He wanted him to be raised in a superior Western values rather than Indian values. But we can also gauge what was the inner reason for this. And the inner reason was that he needed to have a fresh perspective on Indian culture and civilization. So away from tradition, once he came into contact again with India, he had a very fresh perspective on all our culture, cultural history and so on. For example, his interpretation of the Veda. No one had been able to decode the Veda like Sri Aurobindo because people were still stuck in the traditional route, that the traditional way of interpreting the Veda. But Sri Aurobindo saw the Veda as the core of Indian philosophy, and because he was not acquainted with the traditional thought, he was able to find the truth of the Veda. Similarly, there was another inner reason. It was to understand the British temperament and politics. So Sri Aurobindo, through contact with British nation, he was able to understand what kind of temperament the British had, what are their political ideals and so on, and he would make good use of them during the nationalist struggle. So other leaders were not as aware of British politics as Sri Aurobindo was. So once Sri Aurobindo came back to Baroda, and we know that he purposefully failed the ICS test, he started writing articles for his friend's journal called Indu Prakash. He criticized the weakness of the Indian political mind. He criticized the then National Congress, which was formed just 8 years back. And he was told to stop writing because these articles created such an uproar in the nation. I think it was M.G. Ranade who asked Sri Aurobindo to stop writing in that journal. So Sri Aurobindo stopped writing for a while, but he started familiarizing himself with Indian culture more. So he learned Sanskrit, he learned Bangla, he studied Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, he studied Madhusudan Dutt, he translated Indian epics into English, and so on. So his idea of India got, he was able to create a political vision for India. And because of that, he wanted some foot soldiers to implement that political vision. And he got them in the form of Jatin Banerjee and Barin, his younger brother. He sent them to Bengal and worked with the Anushilin Samiti there. They created these youth organizations in Bengal, which worked towards re-energizing the youth there for the revolution. He also started meeting all the political leaders around the country, and primarily Sister Nivedita and Tilak were his contact persons. When the partition of Bengal happened in 1905, we see that there was such a explosion of energy in Bengal because of the work that these people created, because the work that these people did in the years before 1905. So Sri Aurobindo, when the partition of Bengal happened, he moved to Bengal and he organized the anti-moderate faction there. So Congress was led by the moderate faction at that time. He led the anti-moderate faction and he organized their political philosophy. So he introduced a fourfold program to their philosophy, which was Swaraj, national education, Swadeshi, and boycott. So essentially, these are the four principles that Sri Aurobindo based his political action on, and we will see how that relates to his philosophy of nationalism. His idea was that he wanted to capture National Congress and create an informal state within a state to carry on the freedom struggle. As a Bande Mataram, as the editor of Bande Mataram, he was extremely successful in spreading the extremist message. So Bande Mataram was read throughout the country. And once that support of the people reached the threshold, he guided Tilak to split the Congress at Surat. So in 1907, Sri Aurobindo split the Congress into two factions. One was extremist and one was moderate. And he placed the ideal of complete independence before the country. So all this work he did in only 3-4 years. So we can see how sharp was his mind and how sharp was his action. The British government knew him to be the most dangerous leader of the revolution. So what they did was they tried to put sedition cases on him. First was the Bande Mataram case through which he came out, and his popularity grew manifold because people came to know that Sri Aurobindo was behind all these revolutionary actions. But later he was arrested in the Alipur bomb trial case, and he had some transformative experiences in the jail that we know about. Once he came out of the jail, he observed that there was a loss of vitality in the nation. So he started journals like Karmyogin and Dhamma, and government again knew that Sri Aurobindo would cause trouble to them, so they tried to put again sedition cases, and eventually Sri Aurobindo left Calcutta for Chandranagore and later Pondicherry when he received a divine adesh to do so. So in short, this is a quick summary of Sri Aurobindo's political life. But when we talk about Sri Aurobindo's action to rejuvenate India, so we have to understand it from a perspective of his idea of nationalism. So Sri Aurobindo saw a nation as we earlier saw, as formed of a spiritual, mental, vital, and physical body, right? And if we look at his nationalist program, the fourfold nationalist program, Swaraj, national education, Swadeshi, and boycott, so this corresponds to these four bodies itself. So I'll tell you how. So Sri Aurobindo observed that India had declined in all these four components, the spiritual, mental, vital, and physical, during the conventional age. He knew that British and Islamic rule had contributed to the decline massively, and he understood that the political unity that British had formed, that could now be used to bring out the psychological aspect of that unity. And his action was guided based on these two principles. So if we look at the spiritual decline first, so spiritual decline is the reason for all the other declines. We know the reason of spiritual decline of India, so Sri Aurobindo has stressed that point many times in his works. He said that India divorced spirituality from life under the influence of Mayavad and Buddhism. And that was the reason that India declined during the conventional age. And the zeal for life in India was exiled. India didn't, people didn't do any adventurous work. Their life moved in very small circles of family and caste. So this was the effect of Mayavad. So to counteract this, Sri Aurobindo started developing his own life-affirming spirituality. He gave a spiritual foundation to nationalism. So what he did was he he used universal Indian motifs, like he called Mother India as a goddess. He revealed Vande Mataram to be a mantra. So these are universal Indian motifs that every common Indian would understand, and he brought them together through these universal motifs. And he also, through his fourfold program that we talked about, he placed the ideal of Swaraj. And he said that inner Swaraj would lead to outer Swaraj. Inner Swaraj means that our own national self, we had to first place it in our inner being. And after that, it would manifest in the liberation of the nation. So Sri Aurobindo had a lot of focus on this, countering the spiritual decline, and he used these methods to counter it. From a mental point of view, Sri Aurobindo had noticed that in India there reigned something called as thought phobia. So Sri Aurobindo says that because of this thought phobia, the normal person, the normal people are unable to think and decide for themselves. So they always refer to some shastra or say some authority. They don't want to think for themselves. And Sri Aurobindo says that this was made, this occurred in India because of primarily the British education system. Sri Aurobindo was himself a professor in Baroda, we know that, and he had observed what kind of education was being provided to the children there. He mentioned it in a simple line. He's mentioned that the mechanical instruction and rote learning spoiled the intellectual habits of the brilliant and supple Indian intelligence. So essentially, mechanical instruction and rote learning. So we see that that system is still there in our schools. Spoiled the intellectual habits of our country, and because of that, people were unable to think for themselves. So to counteract this, Sri Aurobindo made national education a key part of his fourfold program. He emphasized on an Indian education that was meant for Indians, based on the Indian temperament. He has written a series of essays titled The Brain of India, in which he mentioned the main psychological principles that made India such an intellectual power in the past. What were the main psychological principles behind that? And he mentions brahmacharya and so on, which made Indians such an intellectual power in the past. Also under his inspiration, new colleges and schools were opened in Bengal. And even though there was such a financial hardship at that point of time, but people worked in them and trained future leaders in those schools. Now coming to the vital and physical decline. So Sri Aurobindo observed that Indian society was submerged in tamas or inertia. So if you read any topic, any article from Sri Aurobindo in Vande Mataram or Karma Yogi, you will see that his main point has always been that Indian society has to come out of its tamas. So any Rajasic activity or any Sattvic activity would do, but India has to come out of tamas. And Sri Aurobindo observed that Indians had acquired bourgeoisie habits due to British policies. So bourgeoisie habits, what do we mean by that? That Indians are in love with their comfort, so they are not ready to sacrifice for the nation. But in the past, Sri Aurobindo mentioned that Indians had the example of Harishchandra, Dhruva, Prahlad, who went through enormous sufferings but didn't abandon their dharma. But now Indians are not able to sacrifice even their smallest comforts for the nation. And he said that that was a creation of the British education and policies. Also, Sri Aurobindo noticed that this inertia manifested in the economic decline of India. So India was a world economic superpower before the British came. India, I think, created around 25% of the world GDP at one point of time, but it reduced to around 1.7 or 2% of GDP after the British came. So this kind of decline Sri Aurobindo had to counter. And first of all, for the economic decline, he had two programs. One is Swadeshi and another is boycott. So Swadeshi means that you have to encourage Indian industry, while boycott means you have to minimize the influence of the British industry. And Sri Aurobindo had a very keen understanding of Indian industries. He mentioned the issues faced by agriculture, by glass, by textiles industry, by arts and crafts industry in one of his speeches that he wrote for Maharaja of Baroda. And if you read that essay, you will come to understand how detailed Sri Aurobindo's understanding was of Indian nation and what we need to do to revive the industry. And to counter the bourgeoisie habits, Sri Aurobindo had already, as we know, sent Barin and Jatin to Bengal, and he was organizing the revolution there. So he had, these organizations generally met in gymnasiums or akhadas. So essentially their physical culture training was provided to these youths, and they would meet there and discuss about lives of great people like Mazzini and Garibaldi, who led the Italian Revolution, and about Swami Vivekananda, or they read about Bhagavad Gita and discussed amongst themselves how they can manifest the philosophy of Bhagavad Gita in their life. So these kinds of actions Sri Aurobindo tried to re-energize India. So this is just a brief overview of Sri Aurobindo's action overall in the national movement. We know that later leaders like Annie Besant, like Gandhiji, took Sri Aurobindo's fourfold program. They also introduced the same components like Swadeshi, boycott, Swaraj into their own actions, but they introduced some key distortions as well to Sri Aurobindo's ideas, due to which India was not able to progress. And that is actually a whole other topic, and that is a very fascinating topic because Sri Aurobindo has himself commented on how they distorted his ideas, and because of which India was not able to progress. But I won't be able to cover them here because of the brevity of time. So I'll just try to end this discussion today with invocation from Mother that she made on 15th August 1947. And that displays the essence of Indian nationalism, because Sri Aurobindo always mentioned that India was not rising for herself, but for the mankind. So I'll just read that invocation and I'll open the floor for any questions. So the Mother says in her invocation, "Our Mother, O soul of India, Mother who has never forsaken thy children even in the days of darkest depression, even when they turned away from thy voice, served other masters and denied thee. Now when they have arisen and the light is on thy face in this dawn of thy liberation, in this great hour we salute thee. Guide us so that the horizon of freedom opening before us may be also a horizon of true greatness and of thy true life in the community of the nations. Guide us so that we may be always on the side of the great ideals and show to men thy true visage as a leader of the ways of the Spirit and a friend and helper of all the peoples." So with this, I'll just open the floor for any questions.
See, sir.
Yeah.
You talked of the national unity, how the nations, smaller units, they get together, and the nations have been formed. Now, in the current scenario, there are instances where within a nation state, new nations are emerging. For example, Yugoslavia,
Right.
Serbia, Bosnia, and all that emerged. And some of the nations which developed, they erupted out of a bigger unit into smaller units. They have done well for themselves, whereas the others, the others which came up at the same time, they have not done well for themselves. So in the light of Sri Aurobindo's yoga, how can one perceive that?
Right. So I think we have to understand one thing, right? So the national boundaries that have been defined in the world as of now, so they may not agree currently with the actual national boundary that should exist. So the national grouping may be different. For example, in the Middle East, we see that all the nations that have been created, so they are not exactly national unities. So they have been carved out by the British colonial idea of how a nation should look like in that space. For example, in Africa, we see that nations have been created through a sort of zigzag movement, right? On the map, if you create a line here and a line there, and if a river is passing here and a river is passing there, so they have created nations like that. So they are not true national unities. If a national unity is there, like I've mentioned, so it would always recover its oneness. And if there is no national unity, then it would break up, right? So it would break up into the true national unity. So in case of Yugoslavia, for example, if it broke up into different nations, so the reason is that there was no true national unity between them. And a national unity has always a tendency to recover its oneness. So I think that may help answer your question.